We make humble offerings on our altars that you may be nourished and fed the boundless food today and all days. Please allow our senses to be open today and to receive from all these teachings that which we most need to hear. Thank you. Greetings, my Dharma sisters, brothers, transgender, non-binary from Corvallis, Oregon, the ancestral land of the Kalapuya and Chippewa tribes. My name is Ryushin Hart. My pronouns are he and him. And this talk today will weave between the topics of racism, shame, and trauma. And I want to highlight at the outset that the connective tissue between all three topics is vulnerability. It seems fair to say we've all been feeling more vulnerable in the last few months. Essentially, every Sangha has altered their schedule or format. Some groups have let go of their brick and mortar locations altogether. Others are having that heart-wrenching conversation about whether to keep their Zendo when there's no clear timeline for the pandemic's resolution. And at the same time, the past few months have seen a mass of white people joining people of color in conversations about systemic racism. We're seeing these conversations emerge in a variety of contexts, including our Sanghas, if they hadn't been happening there already. And personally, I'm overjoyed to see these conversations spreading like wildfire, especially given that Zen has been behind the curve when it comes to racial justice and creating spaces that are welcoming for the beautiful diversity of our human community. We can simply look around the room of who's attending this conference to see that we haven't done enough to create spaces where all Buddhas and Bodhisattvas feel welcomed. Personally, as a straight, white, cisgender man, I've been trying for the last decade to understand systemic oppression in its numerous contexts and what I can do to be a positive voice for change. I'm trained as a clinical social worker with education in racial justice, oppression, trauma. I've done personal work deconstructing masculinity and gender, extensive therapy, which all came on top of nearly a decade of monastic training. And for most of this past decade, I've also been studying and applying in my life tools of shame resilience laid out by Brene Brown, the PhD social worker who's initiating a national conversation about shame and wholeheartedness. And what I've noticed in my own ongoing process is that at each step of expanding the heart and mind to understand and include a new layer of oppression, I experienced shame. So we're on the same page. Brene Brown defines shame as the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. I would add to her definition, humbly, that shame exists on a spectrum, like all other emotions, so shame can be quite subtle or intense or anywhere in between. Basically, shame is that sweaty wash of inadequacy where you feel small and you wish you could disappear. It's distinguished from guilt, where in a given situation, guilt focuses on one's behavior. So if I slept in, for example, that meant that I was late to my appointment, while shame would focus on my identity. I slept in, and that means that I'm a failure or I'm lazy. To further highlight how shame plays out, I'm gonna share a recent experience where I experienced it. So as this conference was approaching, I decided to offer a talk, and when I started preparing, my shame gremlins came in, because there are a few things more vulnerable for me, the part of me that identifies as a Zen priest, than speaking to a group of Zen priests about a topic that I'm passionate about. And my shame gremlins told me stories like, I haven't studied these tools enough, or I'm not smart enough to communicate effectively. As a side note, shame loves to tell us stories on the theme of inadequacy. In US culture, people may feel shame about not being strong enough or rich enough or attractive enough, while in Zen, shame may appear as an inversion of these traditional values. So we as Zen priests might feel shame about earning too much money and not being ascetic enough, or being too busy and not sitting enough zazen or sesshin, or spending too much time with our family and not being monastic enough or priestly enough. But regardless of the metric that's used, the punch of shame is just as painful. In my situation, I was preparing for my talk, shame gremlins arose, and I had a somatic experience of shame, which for me, it shows up as my stomach dropping, my heart closing, and the upper chest tightening with a wave of heat spreading out towards the arms. With the help of a friend, I climbed out of that shame hole, so I finished my talk and I'm not feeling persecuted by those gremlins speaking to you now. Now, I just shared how shame manifests in my body, and one of the first steps in being resilient to shame is knowing our unique constellation of somatic experiences that indicate that shame has arisen. And the reason that's so important is because shame is experienced as trauma. So what do I mean by that? If we return to our definition, shame is the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we're flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. As social creatures, we have survived based on belonging to a clan or tribe, and not belonging significantly decreased our chances of survival. So our neurobiology has developed over millennia to experience even the feeling of not belonging as an existential threat. And if we consider just in this lifetime, as an infant, every person here was completely dependent on others for their survival, for their food, their shelter, their warmth. And I'm willing to bet that all of us have had the experience, whether we remember it or not, where our parent or caregiver didn't hear us crying or was busy or didn't prioritize us, which meant that for some period of time, our needs weren't met. Even one experience like that plants a powerful traumatic memory that not being loved or belonging is a direct threat to our life. And as a result, shame initiates the same stress response as if you were driving down the road and a tractor trailer swerved in front of you. So when our stress response is greater than our coping resources, even if that situation is not immediately threatening to our life, our brain experiences it as trauma. So shame is experienced as trauma, and talks about racism have a high potential to initiate feelings of shame for the person who's been directly impacted by racism, for the person with the structural power and privilege, or both. There are two reasons I want to highlight the connection points between these three topics. First, shame is one of the most contagious affects. When shame is in the room, it can quickly spread and derail a conversation, particularly an important and vulnerable one like the topic of racism. And second, we don't make the best long-term choices when we are in shame and our stress response is activated. Neurologically, our limbic system jumps to the fore and dumps adrenaline and cortisol into our bloodstream, which tenses our muscles and sharpens our vision and making lightning fast decisions, which is wonderful if you need to fight off a bobcat or jump out of the pathway of a car. But it's less helpful when you're sitting in a room with your Sangha talking about the power and privilege that comes from having a lighter skin tone. So the cost of our amazing fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response is losing significant access to our prefrontal cortex, which plays a major role in rational thinking and impulse control and long-term planning. So in essence, when we are in shame, we often make choices that exacerbate that state. A story from the shame resilience research, a woman had her card declined at a gas station, and the cashier made her leave her wedding ring and her wallet while she drove to the ATM. She said she slammed the door, waking up her 6-month-old child, who started crying, and as she was driving down the road, she started swearing, "Shut up, shut the F up." She said she had never sworn in front of her child before that point, and the story going through her mind is not only am I white trash, but I'm also a lousy mother. So shame can lead us to engage in ways that exacerbate it. And everyone experiences shame. Or to be more precise, the only people who don't experience shame are people with no ability to empathize, more commonly known as psychopaths. So decades of sincere spiritual practice, even Zen practice, does not make you immune to shame. However, I would suggest that Buddhists have tools that can be utilized to more skillfully navigate our shame response. As Daishin will talk about, the Satipatthana Sutta begins by grounding our awareness in the body. And when we're experiencing shame, one of the most effective ways to recognize it is in the somatic response. Also, most of us have developed this skill from Zazen to stay with our experience rather than reacting when intense emotions arise. Now, it may feel harder to pause and breathe or step away if we're in leadership positions and feel that our role as a teacher can only be manifested in one particular way. But Zen practice calls us to be vital and responsive. And a role can't simultaneously be restricted to one manifestation and also be fluid and responsive. So I'd actually suggest we have a unique opportunity as Zen priests and Dharma leaders to demonstrate that it's okay to be fully human and to take a break if that's what we need in order to be most effective, with two caveats. First, the power dynamic caveat is that we need to communicate our human limitations in ways that don't unintentionally ask those with less structural power and privilege to take care of us. And if there are people of color in the room, multiply that statement by 100, because people of color have been asked to do that labor of caring for centuries for white people. And it's well past time to change. Second caveat, the white supremacy caveat. In reference to conversations, particularly about racism, it's important for white people to understand that our people have historically not been willing to acknowledge racism alone, let alone our specific role and responsibilities. So if we have a wave of shame that arises and we need to step away, it's important to communicate that this conversation is important, that we're deep in shame, that we need to step away to take care of ourselves, and that we will reschedule because this is an important conversation. It's also incredibly important and helpful to use the word shame when that most accurately describes your experience. There's a tendency, at least in the US, to feel shame about even using the word. But that very reason makes it that much more powerful to communicate we're experiencing an emotion as intense as it is vulnerable. So before I close, I want to thank you all. Thank you for showing up to the best of your ability. Thank you for recognizing anti-racism as Dharma work. And if you take one thing away from this talk, let it be a greater respect for how devastating shame can be to the meaningful conversations that I know you're all wanting to have about racism and anti-racism. If you have questions about what I've shared, we can talk about this afternoon during the open space discussions. If you're interested in exploring the topic further, consider joining the Shame Resilience group that I'll be coordinating specifically for Zen priests and Dharma leaders. You can email me that information. And I'll end with a prayer by Laverne Cox, a powerful Black transgender leader. Spirit, Buddhas, ancestors, give us the permission to do this imperfectly and to be of service. Thank you.